Hello and welcome to another episode of I Missed Book Club. I'm your host, Veronica Reynolds, and today I'm joined by a lovely guest host, new to our show, Karen Ostertag. Karen is our adult services librarian for our library, and she particularly has, for many years, you can explicate how many years, been collecting speculative fiction. Which we'll get into what that even is today on today's episode, but it's our ooky spooky episode. So we're going to be talking about paranormal romance, dark fantasy, and other more fantastical ways. For those of you who've been listening a while, you know that I love horror books, and Karen and I did run for several years together, and then she did it on her own, a speculative fiction book club, and we rotated between horror, fantasy, and science fiction. I usually got to choose the horror books, which was very delightful for me. But for now, Karen, say hello.
Hello.
I am going to ask you the question I ask all my guest co-hosts. What is a book that made you?
So I spent far too long thinking about this, and I basically got it down to two. There's a book that, embarrassingly for a librarian, I can't remember the author or the title of. I read it in, I think about 5th grade, and it was about the life of little kids in a barony. And there was a scene in there where they went hawking together, and I don't know, that just stuck with me. And eventually that ended up in a medieval studies master. So there you go. The other one I think is Loretta Chase's Lord of Scoundrels, which was the first romance that I read that actually to me felt romantic, that didn't feel like an adult version of taking Barbie and Ken and smashing their faces together. Mm-hmm. It's the first romance that I read where the female lead really had agency and taught me that romance was something that I might actually enjoy reading as an individual genre, as opposed to just something I got a side serving of along with my fantasy.
Which is very important because Karen is now the collector of our romance collection as well. And a prolific romance reader.
Romance you don't hate. Collecting a very good to be collecting a collection you don't hate.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I hated any of the collections that I ever, collected together. But when I was in collection development, I did have the 300s, which if you're a librarian is, we call it the dumping ground. All the things that don't belong anywhere else kind of wind up in the 300s. And there's parts of the 300s that...
Everything that has to do with people.
Yeah, it's kind of this like miscellaneous category, I would say. But and parts of it I liked a lot. True crime winds up in the 300s. And some other kind of really interesting law stuff winds up in the 300s. But there's also a lot of stuff that's just like, this is where all the test prep books are, which is hard to work up a lot of enthusiasm about. Time to rebuy the Ed and Kleck's books. That's what I would say about the 300s.
Yeah, the very, very first collection that I got when I started as a baby librarian, I didn't even get a full century. I got a decade. I got the occult section.
Nice. Of the 200s?
No, of the 000s.
Oh, right. So, okay, so if you don't know Dewey...
Oh, no, sorry, the 100. So like 130, I think it is.
So the difference is that 100s is kind of classified as like philosophy, and the 200s are religion. And as you can imagine, sometimes those are very inextricably bound together. And Karen now also collects the 200s.
And the 100s now.
And the 100s now, yeah. But all that being said, the collection we're interested in today is the one that about, I want to say 15 years ago, almost now, we reclassified into what we call speculative fiction. It used to be the science fiction and fantasy section, but we went with, particularly Karen went with, speculative fiction when we moved it downstairs, right?
Yes.
Okay. So why don't you tell the people what you think speculative fiction is?
So speculative fiction, and the reason that we reclassified the section is that the idea of genre gets very fluid at that end of things. So science fiction, horror, fantasy, and maybe throw in a little dash of mystery and romance, all frequently got jumbled together, especially around the time period that we were doing the reclassification. You might have heard the term thrown around, the new weird.
Mm-hmm.
So authors like Jeff Vandermeer and to an extent Neil Gaiman were doing a lot of genre bending with their writing. They weren't writing things that were classically fantasy or classically sci-fi or classically horror. They were taking a little bit from each pot. And
steampunk comes to mind for me pretty readily because steampunk has
Yeah.
like the science fiction element, but it's set in a very like fantasy time period.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of things that, because steampunk inherited a lot from science fantasy, basically the very, very early science fiction, that also really, a lot of it, I think, wouldn't conform to what we would today classically call science fiction.
You know what I think of? It's one of the books we actually did for the book club. I don't know if you remember it, Bone Shaker.
Yes.
Bone Shaker is this like post-industrial, it was written probably about 10 years ago now. It's like this post-industrial steampunk kind of thing. And it's really, I thought it was an interesting riff on like coal mining, unionizing, things like that.
Yes. And with a very hefty dose of horror in it too.
Right.
But even things like H.G. Wells. I mean, you look at things, you look at his works, and you look at things like The Invisible Man. We would probably classify that today, oh dear, somewhere
it's messy,
between
right?
Science fiction and horror.
Right, because if it's part of if you look at the movie versions, it's considered a horror movie, right? It's like one of the early MGM horror classics.
Yes, and the science in it is very hand wavy.
It makes me think of that very famous Arthur C. Clarke quote that any science sufficiently advanced is magic.
Yes.
And I think that's when we talk about speculative fiction, that's one of the things we talk about, because if the science fiction is so out there that it's ununderstandable in a way, like there's your sci-fi where it's like, the name of it just went out of my head, the Matt Damon movie, Mark Watney, he's growing potatoes on Mars.
Oh, The Martian.
Yeah, on The Martian, which they made the Matt Damon movie of. Like that is to me like very interesting science fiction, and that like the science is all written out. It is based on scientific fact that we have now with very little literary license. And that's like hardcore sci-fi in a way, even though it's not like big space guns, which is what I think of with like out there science fiction. And then you have science fiction where they're like, we have hyperdrives because reasons.
Yeah, I would classify that as hard science fiction, which is basically any science fiction that is playing as close to the rules of our current reality as possible.
And so
you don't find things in there that we don't currently know about.
Right. And I think where this becomes interesting for what we're talking about today, I had originally asked Karen to talk about paranormal romance because it's a crossing of her two major areas of interest. You have the romance novels and you have the fantasy part of paranormal. But the more as we were talking about it, that's a messy genre definition as well, right? Like how would you define paranormal romance at this point as distinct from other genre?
So supernatural romance or paranormal romance or PNR, you might see it abbreviated. It's basically things go bump in the night and they want to go bump in the night with you. That's kind of what it comes down to.
Well, I like that.
It's taking all of the classic and sometimes not so classic monsters and critters from horror and making them objects of romance, and very